I wish to start today or speak today on medicine in Egypt. And I wish to weave a little bit of history into this little snippet. Egypt was founded on the banks of the river Nile. In prehistoric times, Neolithic man founded small colonies along the banks of the Nile. And these coalesced together over a period of time to form a mighty empire, a mighty civilization. This was possible, believe me, because of the life-giving waters of the mighty Nile, a 4,000-mile river. The White Nile from the Victoria, the Blue Nile, and another small tributary from where the name I forget. Civilized Egypt lasted for 27 centuries of peace and tranquility. Egypt indeed is an ancient land, a land of antiquity. If I may say so, Egypt was ancient even to the ancients. And let me tell you why. Egyptian civilization flourished 1,000 years before the Minoans built their castle, their capital, in Knossos in Crete. 500 years before Moses led the Israelites from thraldom to liberty. 2,500 years before the beginnings of Rome. Now you understand why this civilization was ancient even to the ancients. You would wonder, what had the banks of the Nile to do with this civilization? But many great civilizations have started on the banks of great rivers. Not just the Egyptian. The Mesopotamian civilization along the banks of the Tigris, Euphrates. The Indian civilization on the banks of the Indus. The Chinese civilization along the banks of the Yellow River. Why? I think it was Toynbee who said that for a civilization to flourish, wherever man settles, there must be a challenge, so that this challenge can give rise to an effective response. If the challenge is too great, there can be no effective response, and civilization may start, but it soon dies, as it did in many other situations. If the challenge is too weak, it lulls the settlements into a somnolence, and civilization does not progress. Now, I just want to tell you a few historic facts about Egypt before I go into its medicine. Egypt was ruled by the pharaohs. The pharaohs were like gods. They were the supreme rulers. They completely believed in the divine right of kings. That's the first thing. There were many gods in Egypt. Some were gods that could do harm. Some were gods that could right that harm. There are further important facts that you need to know. Egyptians believed in the afterlife. They believed the afterlife was as important as the actual life they lived. Therefore, they wanted to preserve their bodies, and when they buried their bodies in monumental tombs, they would put all the great belongings of that particular person within that tomb. How did they preserve their bodies? They mummified them. They would draw out the substance of the brain through the nostrils. They would leave the heart where it was. They would put an incision on the sides of the abdomen, withdraw all the viscera from there, fill it with herbs and all sorts of various material to preserve the body. They would wrap the body in bandages and keep it in soda for almost 2 weeks. The secret of mummification has not been yet learned by the best scientific methods that we have been able to apply. Imagine preserving a body for more than 2,500 years as the Egyptians did. I told you about the many gods. I just thought I'll name a few because they're important. Thoth was a god of healing. He was in charge of the ancient books of healing that were placed in a temple in Heliopolis. And the gods that they worshipped were the sun god Re, Osiris, Isis, the wife of Re, and Horus, the son of Isis. I'll tell you why later, if I can, if I remember why these are so important. These are important. Now coming to the medicine part of it. The first medicine in Egypt, as the first medicine in all ancient civilizations, was magic. Evil spirits entered the body through various orifices, produced disease, and these were exorcised by magical chants, by magical means. Then came the priests. So the priest-physicians then dominated medicine. And then came empirical medicine. I'd like to explain to those who are not doctors what empirical medicine means. I'll just give you some examples. For example, cinchona was derived from the cinchona bark, and it was found by the ancient Jesuits that when given to a person with fever who had chills, the patient fared well. So whenever a patient had fever with chills, cinchona was the remedy. And it did help. Ultimately, it was found that cinchona contained quinine. But the reason why it helped, what was the mechanism why it helped, was not known. So that's empiricism. A great deal of medicine, believe you me, is still empirical. I think it is extremely important to remember that. Physicians in Egypt were remarkable. For one thing, they were paid by the state. They never earned their own. The state paid them. You started with the smaller physicians, which perhaps would be equivalent to our general practitioners, better physicians, still better physicians, and then you had the main physician. And he was generally the head priest. That happened for a long time, but subsequently, medicine began to be practiced by a professional body, which was divorced from religion. You will be amazed to realize that even in ancient Egypt, there were specialities. So there would be a special physician for the head, or the neck, or the chest, or the tummy, or the brain. Remarkably, there was even a specialist for the anus. So there was a speciality that was practiced right from those days. There was no comprehensive look of the holistic aspect of medicine at that time. Somehow or the other, strange as it may seem, it resembles the practice of medicine today. The practice of medicine in Egypt was written down, and there were the two great papyruses, the most ancient papyruses related to medicine. There was the Edwin Smith papyrus written in 1500 BC, discovered I think in Luxor, written perhaps earlier than 1500 BC, but it was discovered in 1500 BC. which gave an account of many diseases, of fractures, dislocations, how they were to be treated, gave case records of a number of sick patients, and most important of all, there was the Ebers manuscript. The Ebers papyrus dates to about 2500 to 3000 BC. It's the most ancient and the first and the most ancient document of medicine in this whole world. It stretched to 20 meters, written on papyrus. Papyrus, by the way, was made from reeds found on the banks of the Rhine, of the Nile. And it contained everything that the Egyptians knew. It contained about 700 medications. It contained a description of various diseases. And it was a Bible that was followed by ancient Egypt. Let me now give you some idea as to how this papyrus came to be read. The civilization of Egypt was hidden from the eyes of the world till the late 19th century, or till the early 19th century. It came to be known, believe you me, when Napoleon started on his expedition to Egypt. His idea was go through Egypt, make his way into India. But he was stopped at Accra, a fortress in Accra, held by the British, by a man called Sir Sidney Smith, and he remarked that his destiny had changed. But he did a great thing, because with him he had got all members, professional members of all humanities, whether it was architecture, whether it was philosophy, whether it was literature, whether it was linguistics. And there was a great linguist in that group which came with him. And whilst the French were digging a trench at a place called Rosetta, they found a stone which goes by the name of the Rosetta Stone. And they found peculiar markings on that. And they realized that it was perhaps a language. The British took away that stone, but a French person got a facsimile of that stone. He studied it for 17 years, and ultimately he deciphered that language. The hieroglyphics was deciphered by two people, a Champollion, the man who accompanied Napoleon to Egypt, and the man who took the stone to London and also takes pride in saying that he also perhaps discovered it, and his name was Thomas Young. You see, the stone had three languages. One was the hieroglyphics, one was in Greek, which of course Champollion knew, and one was in Coptic Greek, which also Champollion knew. And piecing the two together, he deciphered the hieroglyphics. The hieroglyphics in Egyptian language consists of ideas and pictures with, addition to that, the presence of consonants. But it lacked vowels, and therefore it was not a perfect alphabet. Let me go back to medicine. Through the mists of antiquity, for the first time in the world, there arose a figure of a great physician, actual history, written history about this great figure. 2,700 years before the birth of Christ. His name was Imhotep. Translated, it means he who comes in peace. He was the first priest to the pharaoh Zosa. He was a man of many parts. He was his first minister, the vizier. He was a great architect, a philosopher, a sage, a scribe. He was the man who built the first pyramid ever, the Saqqara pyramid, the step pyramid, that is still extant today. He was the man who built the funerary of the King Zoser using shafts, flutes, and bas-reliefs. He introduced them. These are the signatures of Egyptian architecture which are still there, which was still there for a millennium. But above all this, he was a great, great physician, kind, compassionate, charitable to all that he came with. He was loved by the Egyptians. And when he died, the Egyptians lined the banks of the Nile and wept. As his barge sailed down the Nile, they clustered around the banks of the Nile and they wept. After a while, Imhotep was literally deified. He became the equivalent of Asclepius, the Greek god. And the cult of Imhotep became fused with the cult of Asclepius. They called it the cult of Asclepius Imhotep. I think when you think of the Renaissance in the 16th century, and you think of the greatest Renaissance man perhaps that ever existed, Leonardo da Vinci. Here you find 700 years before the birth of Christ, a man who was truly a Renaissance man, a multifaceted personality that you could ever find. I'd like to now just mention to you some ideas of what concepts the Egyptians had in relation to myths. The Mesopotamians believed that the liver was the most important organ in the body. It was the center of the body. Why? Because it was the largest organ of the body. The Egyptians, however, believed that it was the heart, that it was the most important organ of the body, and that it had many channels going out of it, supplying blood, food, and what you have, whatever you have, whatever needs to be had, to all parts of the body. It was almost as if they were imagining what the Nile did. The Nile, towards the end, had spreads out into numerous branches called the delta, which is the most fertile part of Egypt, and then opens into the Mediterranean. Amazingly, the Nile floods almost at a particular time in the year, and that flood time is the time when the soil becomes extremely fertile. Also, just imagine, they said, how did disease occur? Disease would occur if any one of those channels that arise from the heart is blocked. Again, there is a simile to what happens when one of the branches of the Nile, before it enters the Mediterranean Sea, gets blocked. There are floods, there is disaster. So they said if any one of those channels from the heart is blocked, you have disease. The Egyptians also felt that parasites were important in producing disease. For example, they felt that Osiris was bitten by a worm and fell ill. That Horus was stung by a scorpion and became ill. They also believed strongly in the use of enemas. For any malady under the sun, an enema was important. Amazing, but that is the period where enemas started. And as you know, they go on to the present age. And there were a large number of diseases they reported. There was smallpox, there was plague, there was dysentery, there was leprosy, there was evidence of TB of the bone, pot spine in in the skeletons that have been seen. There was no syphilis. There were a lot of infectious diseases. Lots of diseases of the skin and of the eye because of the sand in the desert and the dryness of the climate. In fact, one of the reasons why Egypt was protected, because of the sand, the desert sand on the one side and the sea on the other. So there were plenty of diseases. Ultimately, after 27 centuries, there was a decline in this mighty empire. First it was raided by Lydia, then by Nubia, then by various other neighbors, and ultimately it became the satrap of the Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus and Darius. In 332 BC, I think, or 332 BC, Alexander the Great defeated Darius and he conquers Egypt. So Egypt became a colony of Alexander the Great. Alexander founded Alexandria, which was the center of learning and also the center of medicine at that point in time, Egyptian medicine being more or less transferred to the city of Alexandria. After the death of Alexander, Egypt was ruled by the Ptolemies, one of the generals of Alexander. Alexander the Great, but really not great except as a general and as a warrior. Otherwise, he was a nasty piece of work. He destroyed the great Persepolis, a heritage, a world heritage, which really showed the greatness of the Achaemenid Empire at that time. He burnt it, and there is evidence to say, recent evidence to show that indeed the city was burnt. Well, the last ruler of Egypt was one of the last Ptolemies, and she was Cleopatra. Of course, you'll remember Antony and Cleopatra. Cleopatra was a shrewd woman and thought Antony would defeat Octavius Caesar. But in the sea battle of Actium, Antony was defeated. Antony killed himself as the Romans normally did instead of falling into the hands of Octavius Caesar. And Cleopatra, as you well know, clasped an asp, a poisonous snake, to her breast and died before Octavius could get to her. That was the end of Egypt. It became a Roman colony. The only difference was that whilst the Ptolemies ruled Egypt, the wealth of Egypt remained within its boundaries. And when Rome ruled Egypt, it milked Egypt so that the wealth of Egypt went into the coffers of Rome. That should be all.